But first, I want to talk about the abuse of Keir Starmer last night, the Labour leader surrounded by protesters. Let's remind people of what happened. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, no one, least of all an elected member of parliament, least of all the leader of the opposition, should be surrounded by a mob, as we're seeing now on your screen, clearly subjecting him to harassment and intimidation. That has no place in a democracy. And I think all of us across the political spectrum should unreservedly condemn what we saw there. I think the police made a couple of arrests, which I'm glad to hear. But no one in public life should face that sort of intimidation and harassment at all. It is completely unacceptable.
This is why it happened, Boris Johnson in the House.
This leader of the opposition, a former director of public prosecutions, Mr. Speaker, he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile.
He should apologise unreservedly.
Well, look, I don't think you can say that's why it happened, because some of the people involved in that fracas you showed a second ago,
you know that they were saying Jimmy Savile.
Previously,
you know they were talking about Jimmy
have previously done similar things to people like Michael Gove and BBC journalist Nick Watt.
I've listened to
the whole tape. I've listened to the whole tape, and they did mention Jimmy Savile. They did mention that. They also mentioned Julian Assange repeatedly. They mentioned COVID. They mentioned the opposition more generally. And so I don't think you can point to what the Prime Minister said as the cause of that. You certainly can't blame him for the fact that mob were clearly behaving in a totally unacceptable way.
Should he apologise unreservedly for what he said?
Well, I think what the Prime Minister has done already last week is clarified what he meant.
I'm glad you said that, because we've got that. That was in Blackpool.
I'm talking not about the leader of the opposition's personal record when he was DPP, and I totally understand that he had nothing to do personally with those decisions.
Goes no way far enough.
Yeah, well, I think it does, because it explains that he wasn't suggesting that Keir Starmer personally, individually took the decision on the Jimmy Savile prosecution. But Keir Starmer's own website, Chamber's website, says he was responsible overall for the CPS. And in fact, Keir Starmer himself apologised for the CPS's failings, just in the same way that the Prime Minister has apologised for the failings in number 10 Downing Street in the last couple of years. So I don't think what he said, particularly when clarified in the way that you just demonstrated, means that what he said originally was misleading. You certainly can't say that what he said in any way prompted, provoked or justified the harassment and intimidation we saw last night.
It is a ridiculous slur peddled by right-wing trolls.
He just needs to apologise.
Yeah, well, the suggestion that Keir Starmer personally took a decision on Jimmy Savile is a slur, right, is untrue. Keir Starmer is a decent man who, as director of the CPS, was doing his best. But there were organisational failings at the CPS, which Keir Starmer himself, I think, a few years subsequently apologised for. So I think, with that clarification that the Prime Minister made a couple of days later, that is an accurate representation then of what happened.
Not according...
And I don't think it in any way justified or provoked or incited the terrible and totally unacceptable harassment and intimidation of the leader of the opposition we saw last night.
This is not what the Mayor of London thinks. Sadiq Khan said this is what happens when fake news is amplified and given credibility by people who should know better, but not just him. Nicola Sturgeon saying if he has any decency at all, the PM will now apologise unreservedly. And Sir Ed Davey saying the fact that they were allegedly shouting Jimmy Savile shows that Boris Johnson's words have real-life consequences.
Yeah, well, as I said, I've listened to the whole tape, and they did mention Jimmy Savile. That is true. They also spent most of the time when they were harassing poor Keir Starmer there, talking about Julian Assange, lockdown, goodness knows what else. And the same people that were some of the same people who were harassing and intimidating Keir Starmer had done the same thing to Michael Gove and to BBC journalist Nick Watt. So these are people who've got I'm afraid, sadly, a track record of behaving in that appalling way towards public figures.
So those are three leaders who I've told you who disagree, not just Labour SNP and Lib Dems. This was Julian Smith MP last night. What happened to Keir Starmer tonight outside Parliament is appalling. Is what he said.
Yeah, well, it was appalling. It was appalling.
And he went on to say it's really important for our democracy and for his security that the false Savile slurs made against him are withdrawn in full. Not just him. We also heard from Tobias Ellwood last night, and this is what Tobias Ellwood was saying. Apologise, please. We claim to be the mother of all parliaments. Let's stop this drift towards a Trumpian style of politics from becoming the norm. We are better than this.
Yeah, and that is why last week the Prime Minister clarified very clearly,
They've all heard his
as your clip showed,
not good enough.
that he wasn't suggesting that Keir Starmer personally took decisions about Jimmy Savile, but the CPS, which he ran, overall did have organisational failings, and that's what he was pointing to.